Hello, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much indeed to our guest today, Raja Khalidi. Raja is our special guest. This is being our seventh Palestine deep dive video discussion, and we're delighted that he's been able to find time for us, speaking as he is from Ramallah. Raja is Director General of the Palestine Economic Policy Research Institute, MAS, and is a development economist. He's worked with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, from 1985 to 2013, and as a senior economist, he served as coordinator of its program of assistance to the Palestinian people. He's head of its Debt and Development Finance branch and chief of the Office of the Director of the Division of Globalization and Development Strategies, which is quite a lot to get our heads around, but we're going to be asking him a bit about the work that he has been doing and the work he's doing currently. And also, we're hoping that some of you may be able to join us, send the questions into Raja. We have a very special focus this week, given Raja's expertise on the Palestine economy. I'm Mark Seddon. I used to work for the UN, for the Al Jazeera as the UN correspondent, and previously worked for the UN for the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And last year, I was back with the President of the General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa. Really, before we go any further, before we take any questions, just to remind you, Raja Khalidi is here with us today. And I wondered if I could just begin by asking you, so tell us something about the organization you're working for. I mean, how did it come about, and what are you seeking to do?
Yeah, the MAS was established along with the Palestinian Authority in 1994, so it's just celebrated 25 years of autonomous, independent scientific research amidst a landscape which is, full of all sorts of agendas, political, international, etc. So MAS is a research institute aimed at providing policymakers, government, but also we have a lot of work with the private sector, policymakers in all areas of economic policy with sound, well-studied advice informed by global, regional, and the very specific challenges Palestine faces as an economy which is under occupation, which is struggling to develop state-like institutions. So our position is very much we're embedded really into the policy-making dialogue and into the economic literature on Palestine, and we've created a generation of economists who work with us as staff or experts. I'm the most recent addition to those ranks, but I've been affiliated with MAS for 25 years, including when I was with the UN. So it's an institution, a vibrant institution, small, but we work with a lot of international organizations. We do work with them, as well as Arab funding organizations, Palestinian government, and we try to keep up with the rapidly changing challenges that this sort of a place generates.
I mean, how closely do other countries listen to you? I'm thinking particularly of the Europeans and North Americans, other countries in the Middle East, potential investors in the Palestine economy. What sort of connections do you have with them?
Well, I mean, our work is primarily to generate knowledge, and we have an extraordinarily wide knowledge base on the Palestinian economy, and we know that it's used. I mean, so we are a place where people could come and get the right opinion, get the most recent data. We occasionally, engage in sort of coalitions with the private sector investors, as I said, international research institutes, international agencies. So we work on multi levels, but our core mission is to make sure that Palestinian policymakers listen, ask for advice. I mean, I've worked in the UN, so I know what it means to not listen.
I'll briefly ask you about that, because for some time you were based at the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development in Geneva. People may not be familiar with that organization necessarily, but it's been very powerful over the years, very closely associated with the non-aligned movement and with the Global South, and a very, very progressive voice within the organization. But so, I mean, how do your links with the UN actually help you in the work that you do?
Well, I mean, it's built me. I mean, to be honest, I spent most of the bulk of my career, professional career as an economist with UNCTAD, working on Palestine, in fact. So I was responsible for many years and involved and responsible for many years in a Palestine assistance program, which is a unique sort of a frame for looking at the Palestinian economy compared to the work that you get from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or the donors. So being situated in the in UNCTAD in particular, this sort of a program was able to continue and continues to produce quality research. I also was able, I mean, it also meant that I worked in the division of globalization and development strategies. So when when our last Great Recession hit, I was really fortunate to be, we were in the midst of things, UNCTAD. And UNCTAD's relevance comes and goes, but I mean, it's still there. It's still a voice for developing countries and for development, for justice and international economic relations. So that legacy, you know, I hope that it will, you know, infuse to a certain extent with what we're doing here. But here, you know, we have the same development challenges that other countries have, but as you're aware, we have so few of the tools to
Well, I was just going to ask you about that because, you know, Raja's, you know, Palestine may be recognized by a number of UN member states around the world, but it's still not yet a sovereign state. So, I mean, you don't really have the same kind of fiscal and monetary systems or abilities that other sovereign states would have. So, you know, you can be offering advice, but in practical terms, you must be quite limited in what you can advise the Palestinian Authority to be able to do.
We felt that, I mean, very vividly. That is always a problem. But, you know, the Oslo agreements and the economic framework that it bestowed for the last 25 years gave the Palestinian Authority, let's say, the powers of a provincial, regional government in most in comparative terms. So that included, you know, major taxation, major financial regulation, social service, the whole range, including political and other functions. But so, I mean, within that box, within that toolbox, there has been a lot to be done. And much of the past 10 years, especially, I would say 10 years, because of, there was a second intifada, and then there was a Palestinian political division, and for the last 10 years, there's been a sort of a reform period that was going on, but it did run out of steam precisely for the reasons that you're saying, because we got to a point where what counted was no longer just being able to get, you know, efficiently raise public revenue, but the issue of exchange rates and the lack of, you know, we don't have resort to monetary policy, we don't have resort to immediate control of our trade policy. We're linked to Israel and all of those things. So, you know, the limits, the structural limits of the relationship with Israel are always being brought back to us. And this was seen in the most recent crisis when, you know, we couldn't go to the IMF like anybody else and ask for a loan to help get through it, for example.
Yes. Well, I mean, for people watching and for people who don't have a great deal of knowledge about, you know, the livelihoods of people in the Palestinian territories in Palestine. I mean, can you give us some essential description of economic life for most Palestinians, and what are the mainstays of the economy?
Sure. I mean, this is it's a small, open, developing economy, which means that its natural resource base is very limited. Its space, because of political division, is very, very constrained, and its main reliance has been, and the Palestinian people are still around because of human resources. And it's the human resource base which Palestine has always excelled in, and to a great extent, for the last 25 years, the advice that Palestinians were being given from international economic institutions was build the knowledge economy, build the service economy. That's what you can do in this globalized world. So that, as well as the terms of the economic relationship with Israel, which meant that we adopted the Israeli trade regime, which is a very liberal one, and suffered all the consequences of that, but didn't have the structural the tools to deal with the structural transformation that caused, meant that we've gotten to the point. We got to the point, let's say a few years ago, where that model was no longer working. The export-led development model was no longer working. With, you know, Palestinian industry, we have industries. We've now gotten into a stage where light industries are starting to not, I won't say flourish, but are starting to prove themselves viable, where agriculture, which had been neglected for many years, has now not, I won't say come back into vogue, but we've now realized how important it is to have a certain degree of self-sufficiency. But I mean, the economy tends to continue to be reliant on external resources. And those external resources are both donor resources, but also the fact that 11, 20, 12% of our working force work in Israel.
Raja, we've got a question. Actually, this comes from Shubda, and she has been in touch. She's getting in touch from Delhi, New Delhi in India. She asks, what are the challenges to generating knowledge research regarding economic realities in the West Bank, especially due to the surveillance of Israel and lack of tech sovereignty in Palestine?
Well, I mean, that's a a new dimension of the sort of colonial subjugation that the economy has to live with. The tech, there's a very strong Palestinian tech sector. It's small, it's not very well organized, but it's proven itself in subcontracting arrangements at the level of competing developing countries. But that sector, I mean, our cyberspace is controlled by Israel precisely. Our radiomagnetic space is controlled by Israel, and the ability to access global. I mean, one would assume that in digital economy there are no borders, but no, there are borders, and those borders are to do with the way the big corporations deal with regional hubs and with smaller producers, etc. So we always, even in the pandemic, when we realized, we knew that what was happening here. When I say we were hit badly, everybody in the world has been hit badly. So I mean, this is the first time that we went through an economic crisis that was not specific to us, right?
Yeah, and Raja, on top of this, or before all of this, what we see, from the outside is the situation as pertaining in the West Bank and the occupation and the dependence on the Israeli economy, as you've been outlining. But periodically, these terrible incursions and conflicts in Gaza, which effectively ends up with from an outsider's perspective, almost the destruction of Gaza, and then its rebuild. So, I mean, to a degree, you must be dealing with two economies: the Palestinian economy in the West Bank, and the Palestinian economy in Gaza, or what's left of it.
Actually, we're dealing with more than two economies, but absolutely. I mean, Gaza is the extreme case of what the worst of colonial settler colonialism, if you wish. I mean, all of the terms on which the Gaza economy has been allowed to continue to breathe, let's say, for the last 10 years, have produced really terrible human results in terms of human suffering and in terms of the lost potential, because the Gazans are, as other Palestinians, and hardship breeds the sort of resilience and the sort of productivity and innovation that we've seen despite all of this in Gaza. But when you say two economies, I would say three. We have Jerusalem, we have East Jerusalem. You're talking about 300, 400,000 Palestinians who are, connected very much so to the rest of the West Bank, but live a totally different legal, economic, tax, labor regime than those of us nearby. Then you have the whole area now, which is being threatened with annexation, the so-called Area C, where we have 100,000 Palestinians living in rural, pastoral village settings, about to become subject to direct Israeli rule. So this is it's a crazy patchwork of economic regimes, and the Palestinian Authority only controls a very 40% of the territory of them.
Raja, if you could bring that patchwork together the international agreed norms as for the two-state solution, this is still being argued for. Many people think that it's not really feasible anymore, essentially because of what Israel is doing, and that ideally you have to move towards a secular one-state democratic solution. But all that being said, if you could amalgamate those parts of the Palestinian territory you just talked about, with their different economic models, to form a state, would it be economically viable, do you think?
Look, the question of viability, the first studies about the Palestinian economy after 1967 were entitled, isn't a Palestinian state economically viable? So this is like, we're talking about 40, 50 years ago almost. The question of viability was even posed when they first during the British Mandate, the United Nations partitioned Palestine into two states. The only in that concept of partition, of physical partition, the only concept for economic activity was an economic union. And that economic union was perceived, because of the geography, the interconnectivity, as the only way that a two-state solution could work. Now, what we've had for the last 50 years is we've had an imposed union on Israel's terms, with no recognition of the other side, but effectively the whole of the area under Israeli sovereignty, including the 1.5 million Arabs in Israel, including the 4 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, are effectively, these are, regional economies within the orbit of the Israeli economy. Now, already we're in a situation where the one-state reality is dictating our economic opportunities and horizons. The next stage, the coming stage of potential annexation, or what form it will take, we don't know. But the idea that now what was viable in 47 was like 60%, 50% of the territory of Palestine. Then after 67, 22% West Bank and Gaza Strip. We were down now to about 50% of the 22% left. Now, viability is really how can you have economic viability when there's no political or human viability any longer to the concept? So the idea of Palestinian statelets, if you wish, spread under the Israeli hegemony, economic hegemony, yeah, but that's not a state. That's not what we're talking about. It's not a two-state solution, and it's not a one-state. It's not a secular democratic state solution. It's effectively an apartheid solution, or reality. I don't think it's any solution that anybody would sign up to, but it's what we're increasingly facing. So, this means that the PA is like the nucleus, if you wish, of this Palestinian Arab economy under Israeli hegemony. It's fighting very hard to maintain its ability to govern in the area that it can, in the 40% of the West Bank that it's allowed to govern in. Political division, Arab, regional lack of Arab regional support, Israeli, the rise of fascism and the right in Israel. It's really been a bad year for us. Trump, not to mention Trump in the White House. And so I see a pretty dim horizon right now for anything but, at best, survival of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinians, without the sort of terrible deterioration to violence that we've seen in the past.
Well, Raja, we've had another question. This is from, and it follows on from very much from what you're saying, from Fahed Abu Akal. He says, how can we develop our Palestinian economy when we're under complete Israeli military occupation? Citizens in the USA are not aware that nothing can come in or out without the blessing of the Israeli military. That's the point he'd like to make.
Absolutely. There's as I said, there's a limit to the we can't develop. There is no development under occupation. Let's not make a mistake. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been growth under occupation. We have had growth. Our economy has been growing. People are living, in some ways, materially speaking, better lives than they did 20 years ago. The bestowings of globalization are at anybody's, Palestinians can partake thereof. But there's been a terrible price paid, and part of that is that we've for 25 years, and for 50 in fact, but for 25 years by our endorsing Oslo, we've accepted the sort of controls that he mentions, that Fahad mentions, whereby Palestinian imports are controlled, are coming through Israeli ports, are transported to our territories, across Israeli territories according to Israeli security considerations. Israel collects the tax even and gives us, hopefully a fair record of what they've collected on our behalf. So this number, the levels of strangleholds, if you wish, or choke points rather, are extraordinary. And it doesn't end when it leaves Israel. No, as soon as there's always Israeli internal checkpoints and customs police and other regulations to satisfy. So it's a crazy. But Palestinians have adapted. They're still there. They're still not violently and militarily, but still resisting through their political positions. What administration, autonomous, sovereign or not, around the world has stood up to the Trump administration in the way the Palestinians have? The weakest possible political regime in the region, in the world, have at least said no, for the last however long, and have refused to deal with this carrot that's been dangling,
One thing, Raja, I wanted to mention to you, because it's never been altogether clear to a lot of us, is quite what the role of the quartet has been. Now, I can't recall myself whether the quartet came out of the Oslo Agreement. Certainly wasn't. It was never an official UN body. So maybe you can tell us something about that. But also, I mean, for many of us, from where I'm speaking to you from Britain, our memory is of Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister, who then went on, rather surprisingly, many of us thought, to become the quartet's special envoy to Palestine, and essentially really had an economic job to do. And I suppose my question is, what did he actually achieve? Are there any lasting achievements from Tony Blair and the quartet?
Well, you were surprised that somebody like Tony Blair would end up in our part of the world. We weren't, because we knew what the game was. So in the game, was, and this is, so Blair as special representative of the quartet, I think it was probably the end of 2000s, the noughts, came as a result of the formation of the quartet, which was formed only upon the initial failure, if you wish, of Oslo in the Second Intifada, when everything broke down, 2001, 2002. And then there was the international roadmap, and then there was these new guarantors of the peace process. So that's the quartet. It's the Russians, the Americans, the EU, and the United Nations, or the international organizations. Now, Blair was here as a political emissary of a bygone era where Palestinians still believed in the peace process, or at least believed they had to deal with the peace process. So Blair was tolerated because he was the emissary of the international community. But as the peace process broke down, and before the peace process broke down, it was clear to everybody what his game was. And in the meantime, though, there was something set up called the Office of the Quartet. Now, the Office of the Quartet is actually a bunch of professionals working on things like water, access and movement issues, basically trying to intermediate where they can between Palestinians and Israelis, not to keep the peace process alive, but to keep some sort of economic hopes through cooperation and through Israel, obtaining Israeli permissions and acceptance. So they do important work on water. They do important work on the rule of law. They do important work on trying to get Palestinian exports as a technical secretariat. But the quartet as a political animal no longer exists, which is probably a good thing.
Interesting. I just wonder, because obviously we see how many Palestinian workers have to go about making their living, which is often having to cross from the Palestinian territories into Israel, and to go through interminable security procedures, and sometimes not be able to go to work at all. And of course, on top of this, right now we've got a lockdown, and so presumably an awful lot of Palestinians simply can't put food on the table. But can you explain to us something, what the situation is where you are in Ramallah and elsewhere right now for ordinary Palestinian workers?
Right now, it's pretty disastrous. So you have several strata, social strata, that have been hit by the lockdown, both in terms of jobs, access to jobs in Israel as well as locally. A lot of the private sector workers have been badly affected because the informal economy is like up to 40% of the economy. So it's people who are small, as various micro enterprises, etc. There's been across the board sort of loss of income. Workers in Israel, there are about 150,000 of these people, and some of them are permitted, so are given permits by Israel to work in very specific sectors: construction, agriculture, some industry, some services. Now, this is a commuter labor force, a mobile labor force, a pool, if you wish, that Israel has dipped into probably for more than its existence, even back in the days of Israel, of Palestine, and when you had an advanced Israeli economy requiring cheap manual labor. It's a boon and it's a burden. It's a curse and it's a burden. It's a curse. It's a curse and it's a blessing. It's a curse because it means that you have the much better wages, pushing wage levels up in the West Bank. People who are otherwise quite skilled, but in their professions, going and working in Israel instead of working here. And then there's the financial stranglehold that chokehold that entails. So at any moment, Israel closes for security reasons, or like in the pandemic, you have immediately 100,000 people unemployed overnight. And yet it's I won't say a blessing, but because of the struggle problems of building a Palestinian economy under occupation, you cannot employ your labor force. So it has provided for the daily bread of many, poor, relatively rural populations that otherwise would not find jobs, to be honest. So it's a very tricky thing, and it's obviously a weak point in the Palestinian economy's ability to develop autonomously, because we're constantly subject to Israeli blackmail.
Yes, and on top of this, I mean, I've been looking at some of your modelling and economic projections as a result of the pandemic, and they almost all look really dire. All main sectors of the economy could be impacted, some by as much as 40%. So, on top of everything else, how do you begin to rebuild after this pandemic?
Well, everybody's facing that problem. I mean, you mentioned earlier this idea of building and rebuilding. In fact, in the case of Gaza has been a case of gradually of attrition, rather than ever the reconstruction ever reaching where. So it's been constantly going down. Here, rebuilding is going to be problematic. I mean, it's not a matter of rebuilding; it's a matter of uncertainty and certainty. And the sort of certainty you need for people to reopen stores and restaurants, not only the public health. I'm talking about the economic certainty because of the coming confrontation with Israel. Had there not been this July deadline of potential annexation of the Jordan Valley, probably there would have been a lot more willingness for people to dare and be bold and try new things. But so there's going to be the structural damage left over. However many people get back to work, there's going to be, like in other countries, up to half of those people who were put out of employment in the last 3 months will not be finding work. So that adds to what we're talking. I mean, we projected up to, from a 14% unemployment rate before the crisis, this pandemic, up to a 31% by the end of the year. And I don't think it's going to get much better than that. I mean, we might have some improvement and some rebound, but this is not the sort of situation where you have the tools to engineer a V or an L or a U. You're in an L in recession, and I don't see any rebound. All I can see is that we stop the decline. That's the best we can hope.
I mean, you mentioned the periodic problems of Israel withholding financing for the Palestinian Authority, financing that the Palestinian Authority is allowed under Oslo to raise itself. So it's effective. Israel is actually stopping money that is due to the Palestinian Authority. Now, what people are concerned about is what might happen if this annexation does go ahead and the Palestinian Authority does effectively disband. I mean, who's going to pay for anything?
I mean, effectively disbanding, I don't personally see it happening. I don't see how the authority can effectively. It might. It's going to come. We're heading for confrontation. I mean, for sure. The Palestinian decision to stop security cooperation in response to this annexation has led to a threat by Israel to stop civil cooperation. Civilian affairs cooperation means permits. It means passage of people who are ill into Israeli hospitals. It means people being able to travel outside, etc. So if that's the sort of slippery slope that we're on, I can see that we're going to be coming to a point where probably if we don't have violent confrontation, there's going to be serious cutoff of financial flows. Israel will stop transferring the monthly tax revenues that it's supposed to transfer to the Palestinian Authority. Imports will be interrupted. Palestinian exporters, for what they're, we export about $300-400 million worth of goods to the rest of the world. There's going to be a number of flashpoints, like we had last year when the Israelis withheld some of those tax funds because they wanted to stop the PA to stop paying money to families of prisoners and martyrs, and we're having a similar confrontation this year. And then, this has been a year or two fraught with confrontation, and I just hope that we don't go down the really.
Well, look, a couple more questions have just come in, Raja. I'll summate both of them. The first one is from Naveen Sanduka. Naveen says, recently we've witnessed more business people from the Gulf who are interested in developing partnerships with Israel, totally neglecting the Palestinians. So how can we include the Palestinian businesses in these relations? And how can this all be used as a pressure point to give Palestinians more rights? And another question from Fahad Abu Akel, do we have a strategy for the Palestinian economy, like a 5-year or 10-year or a 25-year plan?
You cut at the end, but you cut a little bit at the end. On the first question, let me just briefly say that the threat, the strategic danger, let's say, of normalization, economic or political normalization between Arab states and Israel is something that that the Palestinians obviously cannot deal with on their own, and will not try to accept by not joining it. So I mean, I think that what we need to see a parallel to that. And there have been efforts, and I know there were attempts by Palestinian business and Palestinian government to set up precisely a parallel set of investment relations, which are not non-existent, but are, Arab investors, like any investor, they see a very uncertain situation. They're not going to easily part with their funds only out of love of Palestine. So I mean, we're in a situation now where Palestinians, where we need support from Arab financial support for Palestinians to just be able to be resilient and resist and not have, resist encroachment, Israeli encroachment and annexation, rather than the sort of building the Palestinian economy type investment that would be needed at a strategic, more strategic.
Well, we have another question from Shubda, and actually it's following on a little from what I was hoping to ask, which was really about the effect of the extensive budget cuts for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. So I wanted to ask you about that, but she also would like to know if the UNRWA training centers have actually helped the Palestinian labor force.
Look, UNRWA is, before the Palestinian Authority, there was UNRWA. It was providing jobs, it was providing education, it was providing health services, it was providing work projects, and obviously the budget cuts, and these are not recent. I mean, this is an attritional, a long trajectory, downward trajectory of cutting for political, for other reasons. But it's still commitment to UNRWA was renewed last General Assembly. It's not only the United States that, however important as it has been, it's not only the United States which the Palestinians and UNRWA can rely on. Luckily, the Europeans and the Arab countries have stepped up, and I think that UNRWA is a part and parcel of Palestinian life. So the training centers are just one of an important part of the vocational training sector in Palestine. Education is now the only service, in fact, that UNRWA provides universally. Its health services are pretty much reduced to certain types of, childcare, etc. And its works and employment programs are a thing of the past. So what is UNRWA today, except an agency that can intervene in times of relief, and like the WFP and other agencies, provide food parcels when it's really bad. But otherwise, its educational system is part and parcel. We can't do without UNRWA, as well as the fact that it runs the camps, and the camps are still there. You can't just ignore that. They will continue until we have some resolution. And those camps are, as you know, are places where Palestinian identity flourishes. So UNRWA is part of Palestinian identity.
I mean, a lot of what you've been talking about is and the importance for the Palestinian economy in terms of future travel, future prospects for people is obviously stability, and that's economic stability and political stability. Do you think that the US presidential elections this November could be really rather more important than most US presidential elections are for which kind of stability follows?
Well, the U.S. presidential. I mean, if this administration stays in power, then it's really bad news for us. And I don't see, this. I mean, what you said earlier about the possibility of this no longer being sustainable. It won't be even necessarily a decision to collapse the PA. The PA will then just no longer be able to function, literally, in the term, because the terms of reference of the past 25 years have been ripped up. This administration has completely negated all of the terms of reference: Land for Peace, 242, occupation, Jerusalem, etc. So the best that can be hoped for is if a democratic administration does at least put a halt to this continued American reversal and complete. I mean, somehow or remove itself from the balance and let the rest of the world work it out. I don't know, but I mean, I don't see, we don't. Too many Palestinian governments have or leaderships over the past have invested a lot in the next American election, and postponed things and said, let's wait until and you'll see after. And this really, it's gotten worse and worse and worse. I mean, Obama was really the big disappointment because of all of the expectations and what he ended up. He tried hard, but he was totally ineffective. And he helped pave the way for Trump in terms of U.S. policy, I suppose, in the Middle East. But I'm sure that whatever Trump does in the Middle East will not have any effect on his re-election chances.
Yes, I mean,
Middle East has never been an issue in American elections.
I mean, all sort of future global predictions are kind of they're all up there right now. We really do live in unprecedented, unpredictable times. And so this final question I'm going to put to you might think it's a bit unfair, but I mean, if you were to look into your crystal ball the next 10, 20 years, I mean, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Do you see the kind of the realpolitik actually of a settler state that can't compromise, effectively losing control in the longer run, or a settler state that can compromise, and for a final just democratic solution to arise in the territories? How do you look at it all?
25 years ago, I was, believing that Oslo was, the right way forward, and I lived it long enough to realize that at the time it was the right way forward. But there was a moment at which we should have shifted course. In the meantime, Israel has gone ahead and continued its state-building project in the West Bank, right? The only real state-building project ongoing in the West Bank is that of Israel through its settlement project. Now, I also know that side of, west of Ramallah is the state of Tel Aviv. And the state of Tel Aviv, if you've ever been there, is like somewhere totally different from what we read about in terms of Israeli politics and the shift to the right and annexation and the settlers. So I know that there are a lot of Israelis out there who would have been happy for a Palestinian state to exist alongside. And the same Israelis ultimately would be happy for the rest of the Palestinians, for the Palestinians to all become Israelis, on the same terms that Arabs, 1.5 million Arabs are Israelis. But this silent majority in Israel is killing us, to be honest, because we're in the meantime the country is being run by a band of crazies, or at least of extreme hardliners, people who have no humanity left in some and no view of the other of Palestinians even existing. So I know that the future 20 years will be Palestinian, Arab, Jewish, Israeli. They're not going. The Israelis. There's no. I have no expectation or demand that they somehow turn into Palestinians or leave. So that Palestinians have long ago acquiesced themselves to the existence of the Jewish people in Palestine. But the terms on which we're now living obviously have to change. So there's going to be a struggle between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, a struggle between Palestinians in the West Bank, and that's moving in terms of correcting the what is now a one-state reality and turning it into a just one-state reality, a democratic one. And that's a long struggle. That's a 20, 30-year struggle, I guess. It's not, the Tel Avivans are going to, and I don't believe that they have to be shaken to their core through either terror or whatever, threatened in order to come to their senses. I think they're going to have to realize where the Israeli right is taking Israel, and realize that there's a very different, that's dangerous, as dangerous for them as it is for us. Yes, that's my hope. So it's hopeful, I suppose.
That's hopeful, and actually looking at on the optimistic side, it's happened elsewhere. South Africa being a good example, perhaps. But look, unfortunately, we have to bring things to a close today, and to thank Raja Khalidi very, very much indeed for his great insights and wisdom. It's been educational, and I would really very much like to thank you, Raja, for coming and joining us today on Palestine Deep Dive, and to thank everybody behind the scenes who have been working so hard to make this happen. And until next time, that's all from us here at Palestine Deep Dive.
Thank you very much, and I'll keep watching your series in the coming weeks. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Raja.